When people enter a country without permission, it's called illegal immigration. When people enter a country in large numbers, even if they have permission, it's called a migration crisis. And when people enter a country in large numbers and we don't like them for some reason, it's called an invasion. So today we're going to talk about nativism and immigration quotas and how fear of the other has shaped America's borders. Now this is part 5 of our Crash Course US History series, made in partnership with a digital studio. We've been looking at how the United States grew from a small British colony to a global superpower. And so far, we've seen that the United States grew through both expansion into new territories and the addition of new people, the Louisiana Purchase and the Oregon Territory, and all those things we talked about in part 4. But now we are going to focus on people, specifically people who moved to the United States from somewhere else. In general, historians think of immigrants as people moving into the United States and Native Americans as people who were born in the United States. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to say that these categories aren't actually mutually exclusive. People can be both immigrants and Native American. For example, my great-grandparents immigrated to the United States from China, but I was born here. So I'm an American citizen who was also born in America, which makes me a Native American. In fact, the term Native American was actually coined by the US government in the 19th century to refer to indigenous people of the Americas. And while most people use it to refer to the descendants of the original inhabitants of the land, now called the United States, there are multiple ways of defining what group of people it includes. But whether we're talking about immigrants or Native Americans, it's important to remember that both groups are incredibly diverse, and any single group will include a wide variety of people with lots of different characteristics and experiences. Like there's a big difference between a recent refugee from Afghanistan and a German aristocrat who moved to America in the 1920s. Similarly, Native Americans today are not the same as Native Americans 200 years ago, which is why it's not super helpful to talk about either group as if everyone in the group is the same. With that said, there is one way that immigrants and Native Americans have shared in common. Throughout much of US history, many Native Americans and immigrants have faced prejudice and discrimination from nativists, people who believe that native-born Americans are superior to immigrants and that newcomers threaten the nation's culture, economy, and security. Now, nativist fears have always centered around a particular group of immigrants that the US was currently experiencing. At different times in US history, nativists have targeted the Irish, Italians, Chinese, Eastern Europeans, and others. Fear of the other has repeatedly sparked nativist responses throughout US history, especially when the people coming to the US were very different from the people already here. So let's go back to the 1850s and look at how anti-immigrant fears first started to take shape. In the 1850s, a lot of immigrants began flooding into the United States from Ireland. Most of them were fleeing the Great Famine, which was a period of mass starvation and disease in Ireland caused by potato crops failing due to a fungus. The famine killed over 1 million people and caused another million to immigrate to other countries. Meanwhile, in the 1850s, the US was undergoing rapid industrialization, which created lots of jobs in factories and mills, but also brought people into close quarters with each other, which helped spread disease. Nativists blamed immigrants for spreading disease, taking jobs, and committing crimes. They formed a political party called the Know-Nothings, also known as the Native American Party, and the party used intimidation, violence, and even murder to keep immigrants out of the country and out of their communities. Their slogan was, "Don't let the foreigners in," which they probably shouted while standing in front of a burning effigy of Lady Liberty. The Know-Nothings would hold rallies where they demanded restrictions on voting rights, which at the time were pretty open. At the time, only property-owning white men could vote, and most states didn't require citizens to be native-born. But after decades of fighting, the movement to restrict suffrage to native-born white men succeeded. By the end of the century, most states had instituted literacy tests and other requirements for voting that disproportionately prevented poor immigrants from exercising their right to vote. Meanwhile, in the late 1800s, the Chinese were coming to the United States primarily to work on the railroads and in mining operations. By the 1870s, though, the Chinese were largely replaced by white workers, and then began to face intense discrimination. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned the immigration of Chinese people and barred those who were already in the United States from becoming naturalized citizens. This was the first law to ban immigration based on nationality. It also established a dangerous precedent. If Congress could legally exclude Chinese immigrants, then they could do it to other groups too. Now the exclusion of the Chinese continued until the 1940s, but in the meantime, other immigrant groups filled the jobs that they left open. In the early 20th century, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Mexico, began to move to the United States in larger numbers. Once again, nativists blamed immigrants for crime and poverty, and they turned their fears into action. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, which limited immigration from any given country to 3% of the number of people from that country already living in the United States. And 3 years later, the National Origins Act lowered that percentage to 2% and created a complicated formula that heavily favored immigrants from Northern Europe. These quotas remained in place until 1965. So during that time, the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe declined dramatically. Instead, immigrants from Canada and Latin America tended to move to the United States because their countries were exempt from the quota restrictions. And as a result, the United States became a less ethnically diverse place than it had been in the late 19th century. Additionally, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 institutionalized racial hierarchies by creating separate categories for white and non-white immigrants. But by the mid-1960s, there was growing support to end the quotas and open up immigration once again. Advocates for change pointed out that the quotas did not align with the United States' role as a global superpower. Also, the civil rights movement had shown that racial hierarchies were morally indefensible, and President Lyndon B. Johnson thought that immigration reform would be a good way to cap off his Great Society legislative agenda. So in 1965, he signed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which finally ended the quotas and opened immigration up to people from all countries equally. This led to a huge increase in immigration from Asia and Latin America and reshaped the United States yet again. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 6 and remember, number 5 is the best number. I'll see you next time.